What's up, YouTube? It's Po Boy fresh back at you with something a little different from the couch at the Bargain Bin studio. If you've seen my videos before, you know that I normally work with the MPC 1 Plus to be exact, with the SP404 Mark II on my master output. But if you've been watching my shorts, you know that I recently finally acquired one of these fun little boxes here. This video I want to discuss why I feel like this has the potential to be a future classic in how it's currently been overlooked, but I think that it's going to have a little bit of a cult following maybe at some point in the future. I don't necessarily believe that it's going to be, you know, the TB303 in terms of its, you know, post-mortem status and how that and the original TR drum machines really blew up sort of post-mortem, but I feel like this thing gets overlooked a lot because of all of its limitations, but sometime in the future I think people are going to really like this thing, probably more so than they do now, and I want to talk about that. This thing is super fun to use. It's very straightforward. I know a lot of people say there's too much menu diving, but it really depends on what you're using it for. I'm making sort of 90s style boom bap. It's really fantastic for that. So I wanted to make a video where I kind of demonstrate some of my personal favorite features on here, talk pros and cons. For me personally, which I feel like my list of pros and cons might be a little bit different than some other people. But first I want to talk about why I'm so late to the party with the P-6. My first ever piece of gear that I got was the 404 Mark II, which is basically like this thing's big brother. And it can also be portable, it can be ran on batteries. You know, it's got a lot more features and everything. It has a screen, it has different chopping modes and so on, but that was very early on in my beat making journey, and I didn't really have enough experience with production in general to work around all the limitations that the 404 has. So that was sort of what put me off of the P6 initially when it first came out, was that, you know, if I'm struggling with the 404 and its limitations, this thing is even more limited, and I probably won't be able to wrap my head around it. But once I got an MPC and I, you know, with the help of all of its, you know, massive tool set and a larger screen and all the visual information, I learned a lot more about beat making and sound design and production in general that allowed me to sort of learn how to better use my ears and better use the tools at my disposal. And I was able to start making better beats on the 404 Mark II as a result of all the learning experience that I had with the MPC. Then on top of that, I was not even aware that this device right here has filters per sample. I did not realize until not even that long ago, I want to say a month or so ago, I saw a video where somebody used the filters. That was something that I was not even aware of, because, you know, when this first came out and people were comparing it to the 404 Mark II, they're always talking about how, oh, this has delay and reverb sends, and it has the variable sample rates and the lo-fi button and all of that, but nobody really mentioned anything about the filters. And that was something on the 404 Mark II that I felt like was a huge miss, was that there was no way to apply a filter or an EQ per sample without having to resample it onto an open pad, and then that's just baked in. There's nothing you can do to change it, you know, and that could be kind of a frustrating thing that, you know, if all I'm trying to do is cut the bass out of my melodic sounds, I either have to sample it in with a filter on the input effects, which is in its own menu, or I have to resample to an open pad that whole thing, or if I've already chopped it up, that makes it even more difficult and time consuming, and now I've got different versions of the same sample spread out all over the place. And it was really nice on the MPC to be able to just apply filters and EQs per sample without having to even use plugins, let alone any resampling or anything like that. So now I want to go ahead and demonstrate what I mean about why this is such a great thing, that these filters and just the workflow on this thing. So I've got this little piece of a drum break here. We can listen to it. And I've done the same thing with this that I did a couple videos ago on the MPC, where I only sampled in exactly how much of the actual break that I needed. I sampled it in mono, and now I'm going to take this and I'm just going to pare it down to a handful of basic sounds. I'm going to put this onto a pattern that I'm not currently using. Let's go all the way over here, pattern 16. Now I can just dial in the start points. Snare right there. Now quickly just hold that pad and then shift play to copy, drop it over here. Now I can go grab a kick, right? I like that kick better. Right? Copy that. Okay, that's fine. Then copy again, do it. Or sorry, enter. I'm so used to the MPC. And I got a hat. Now, super quick, I can go in here and say, hey, I want to put a high pass filter on this snare, right? I'll just go in, set the type to high pass. Good. Now, just like if you're in the program edit on the MPC or any of the menus on the 404 Mark II, you change which sample you're working on and it stays in the same menu and just changes it to all the changes that I'm going to make are going to apply to whichever sample is currently selected. I don't have to back out of the menu and go back into it. So the kicks, I want to do high pass also, but I want a lower cutoff and add a little bit of resonance. Now I'm going to take the resonance out. That's the kick now. That's the kick with the resonance. Do the same thing over here, high pass. Good amount of resonance on there. Now the hi-hat, we can go ahead and you can also, if you need some more crispiness to it, use the lo-fi. And you can even dial in the lo-fi by going shift lo-fi and then using this first control here to adjust the level. So you don't even have to go that deep into the menus for the most part, because these 4 control knobs here give you quick access to like the top 4 controls within any of these menus. So for example, if I go into, I was demonstrating this with the filter menu, I'm not going in and going here and changing the type and then going into the cutoff and adjusting it manually there. I'm just going into the filter menu and I'm using these control knobs like that. Right? Make sure I got 16 steps. It's pretty straightforward. And now I can go in and I can very quickly just hold these steps down, adjust the velocity very quickly through 3 different levels here. You can get more granular with that if you want to, but it's not really necessary. And if you hold it down, you can also change the note. So if I want this to be a slightly lower note, maybe this one's a higher note, a little lower, a little higher. And you can step through by pressing the granular button here while you're holding down that step, and you can change all kinds of things, your note, your velocity. Some of these I don't remember what they do because they don't really matter to me, but you can adjust your micro timing. You got your ratchet, so you can ratchet like that. But now I can just very quickly start creating a pattern. Let's put some snares in here, right? And just like that, using filters and everything, I've beefed up the sound of the drums. I've gotten the low end of the hi-hat and the snare out of the mix. Those filters are fantastic. So that's basically how I've used the filters to dial in these different drum sounds and create a quick little drum pattern like that. Now, I'm gonna go back to one of these patterns I already have for this beat that I'm already working on and just play it real quick. I love that bank mute. So now I want to get into the pros and cons of the P-6. I want to start with the cons because, again, I feel like my list of cons is probably going to be a little bit shorter and a little bit different than what most people talk about. A lot of people talk about the screen and only having 6 pads and the limited sample time and everything. My list of cons really is quite short, and there's going to be some similarities with other people's cons and everything, but the first thing that I want to talk about that kind of bugs me with this device is the way that muting actually works. See, I like the way the bank mutes work and all of that. That's great. But the way that it actually mutes the sounds is by muting the triggers on the sequencer while you have mute enabled. It doesn't actually mute the sound. So if you mute something and you have a longer sample that you've muted, it will continue to ring out after you've muted it, including part of the sample that you might not want to play as part of your beat. So that can be kind of irritating that you have to dial in your endpoints just right and all of that. It's also kind of difficult to visually tell what's muted and what's not. Because another thing too, let's say I mute the drum bank there. If I go into this drum bank, it's muted, but I can still play the sounds. So I can't even test if something is muted by hitting its associated pad because it always plays. The only thing that stops is the triggers on the sequencer. That's it. So that's a bit of a con, but oddly enough, in the same vein, the tails of those samples don't carry over into the next pattern. So if you change patterns and you have a sample tail that you want to carry over into the next pattern, it doesn't actually do that. What you end up having to do is take that same sample, like copy it and take just the end of it and put it at the beginning of the next pattern that you want it to sort of bleed over into. It's not like the 404 Mark II where you have the option of setting it to Mark II mode where the samples bleed over, or the SX mode where they get cut off when patterns change. This, it just cuts them off. There's no option there. So that is a little bit annoying. There's also, as far as I've been able to work out, no way, like on the 404 Mark II, where you can hold the remain button and press one of the effects to bring up the effect parameters so you can adjust them without engaging the effect first. So if I wanted to, say, do a low-pass filter sweep and I wanted to start at a lower frequency and bring it up, right, I would not be able to do that unless the last effect that I had selected was the filter. It would basically just be wherever the filter was at the last time it was engaged, that's where it's going to engage at. So that's kind of frustrating that there's no way to open up the parameters of an effect and adjust them before you engage it. So for live performances, that can be a little bit of a sticking point. There's also no mark button for setting the start and end points of samples while you're listening to them. That's something that the 404 Mark II has a little bit of a funny implementation with that, because it only actually works that way, like on the older SP samplers when you're in the start-end window, but anywhere else it just opens up either the skip back or the looper. But this does not have a mark button at all. The only way to adjust the start and end points is using the start and end controls here, or if you go into the voice menu, you can fine-tune the start position in very small increments. I don't know how small, but in very small increments you can adjust the start and end points of the sample from in there. But there's no way to quickly take like a full sample and just mark in and mark out where you want the start and end points for that. And there's also this is probably one that you've heard plenty of other people talk about. There's no lazy chopping. The only chopping mode is just the equal zone chop or region chop, like in MPC terminology, where you just tell it how many zones or how many chops you want, and it distributes those along the keyboard. I like the way that it does it, where the sample stays in place. It just puts markers on that sample and distributes those across the keyboard. I think that's a great way to do it, but I also think it would be really cool if you could manually dictate where you want those slice points to be. But that's really all the cons that I have. The pros, first of all, obviously pricing. I mean, you have a pretty robust little portable sampler for just over $200. And, you know, the price is kind of hard to beat. It is a frequently returned item on Amazon. That's where I bought this. You know, a lot of people don't really gel with it very well. I think it's fantastic, especially for the price. I like the limitations that it has. You know, the sampling time and everything, I don't know if that's arbitrary or if it's something to do with the way that the memory is laid out. You know, maybe each one of these pads has like a dedicated chunk of RAM that it directly addresses, and that chunk is just a certain size, and that makes it easier for the underpowered CPU in this thing to quickly address those different sounds. You know, for better live playback performance. But whatever the case may be, you know, it doesn't have, it's not as limited as something like an SP1200, where the entire unit has a 10-second sample memory. The sample time limitations are per pad, but it's still fun to work within those limitations, to experiment with how low of a sample grade you can get away with for different types of sounds, and, you know, sparingly using stereo and mono, and kind of making up for that by, you know, using the delay and reverb to add stereo effects to mono samples and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of fun to kind of work around those limitations. The next thing, obviously, and I've kind of harped on this a lot in the video, but those filters, it is so nice to be able to just apply a multi-mode filter to any of the sounds on here per sample. You know, if I just want the bass part of one thing because I like the sound of the bass, I can just dial in that filter. I don't have to resample anything. Literally, you know, you don't need stem splitting, especially if all you're doing is isolating the bass. Low pass filter it. That's all you need. You can beef up your kick drums and everything using a high pass filter with the resonance, like I demonstrated in the demo. So I think that's really cool. I like the sequencer also. It's limited to a max of 64 steps per pattern, but there's a lot that you can do within that limitation. You know, you've got, you know, random chance, and then all the little things like the ratchets and the micro timing, and, you know, you can do motion recording with different parameters and, you know, all kinds of stuff. And for each individual step, you can set a bunch of different things. The pitch, for example, if you're, you know, I like to do a lot of stuff with double hi-hat samples, and, you know, you can impart some extra groove in there by changing the pitch of individual hits along the sequencer. So that's really cool. I also like the bank muting. That's really cool. I keep all my drums on one bank. I can quickly just mute the whole bank. And with drums, the way that the samples ring out doesn't really matter all that much as long as you're actually chopping the drums up into one shots. And then this right here, this is fantastic. It's one of my favorite things about the 404 Mark II is that it acts as a USB audio interface in both directions. You can sample into it from any USB-C device, you know, your laptop, your phone, your iPad, whatever it is, and then you can record back out through the same cable into that same device. So oftentimes, I'll be sampling stuff out of my phone and into the USB and then make my beat. And then without even having to unplug it, I can go into like the voice memos app on my phone and record the beat out in there. You know, it means that also my phone can keep the battery charged the whole time I'm doing that. The portability of this thing was another selling point for me besides just the per sample filters and being able to throw this in my phone with a USB cable in the bag and, you know, a pair of earbuds and I'm good to go. I don't need an audio interface. I don't need a multi-track recorder or anything to hook this all up to with a whole bunch of adapters or anything like that. It just plugs straight into my phone or my laptop for sampling and for recording, which is great. I think this thing is really good for old school, like 90s style, gritty boom bap beats too. A lot of people that use this or that look at it, they think that, you know, the only thing this is any good for is lo-fi beats to relax/study to, you know, because of the low sample rate and all of that and make everything super lo-fi. But it's actually really good for that 90s sound. You know, this beat that I'm working on here, you know, you could maybe see somebody rapping over this, I don't know. And it's certainly not like your typical slow, down-tempo, lo-fi, sleepy beat, right? You know, a lot of people say also that the fact that it doesn't have any external or removable storage solution and, you know, you don't really have that many pattern slots compared to the 404 Mark II, and you don't have that many sample slots compared to other samplers that, oh, it's way too limited on storage. Well, I'm using this thing like a 202 or like an SP1200 where I make a beat on it, and when I feel like that beat is done, I record it and then I delete it and start over. I have seen people like Non-Juror, for example, did a whole beat tape where he had all of the beats on this beat tape were all on here, and he was able to perform the whole thing in one go. I don't personally use it that way. This thing is one beat at a time as far as I'm concerned. And really, I'm not concerned about the lack of a screen because it makes me use my ears, and when you're listening to music and when you're making music, you should be relying more on your ears than your eyes anyway. That's kind of my list of pros and cons for the P-6. I really love this thing. I hope that someday it reaches that sort of cult classic status like some other Roland products from the pages of history. You know, again, I feel like it's a future classic contender. It might not reach the same status as the TB303 in terms of its, like, you know, eventual resurgence into popularity, but I feel like this thing should be more popular than it is, you know, but that's just me. I think it's really fun to use, but that's really all I have to say about the P-6. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.
The tables turn now, got my own label I earn. Like the nigga said, it's dead presidents, money to burn. Queensbridge, pay homage, respect.